Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the Presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of James Garfield, and the focus is life in D.C. The year is 1867, and Congress is on a break, and the Garfields decided to take a break as well. They had never had a honeymoon. Their marriage had always been a little bit difficult, actually at times quite a bit difficult, and this was a chance to go away together. Garfield had always been longing to go to the sea, see the world from reading all those adventure stories as a youth, and this was a chance to go to Europe. They asked Mary, Garfield's sister, to watch their 3 young children, all under the age of 5, Harry, Jim, and baby Mollie, and the 2 of them, Lucretia and James Garfield, were off to Europe. They started in London, where they spent a couple of weeks, and one of the highlights was actually seeing Parliament in action for the American congressmen to see firsthand, the House of Commons, the House of Lords. They also really enjoyed Shakespeare's Stratford-on-Avon, as well as many of the other sites in London. Then went off to other parts of Western Europe, Switzerland, Scotland, Italy, France. It was a glorious 17 weeks of seeing the sights, but really bonding as a couple like they never had before. When they got back, Garfield wrote, "I have been able to transmute gold into aesthetic joys, intellectual growth, heart, life, and better than all, have been permitted to see it transformed into sweet and beautiful decorations of the noblest and truest woman I ever saw. And she is glad to be mine as I to be hers. This surpasses alchemy. It is divine." At long last, friendship, respect, love for one another, all that they had been wanting seemed to finally come together in this trip to Europe. Now, what Garfield wanted when he came back from Europe was a new job. He was a member of the House Ways and Means Committee, and he wanted to be elevated to the chair of that committee. Very powerful committee in Congress. The spot had become open up during the break, but Speaker of the House, Schuyler Colfax, went in a different direction. He gave that chairmanship to somebody else. Garfield did get a chairmanship of the Military Affairs Committee that he had sat on a few years before, but now actually a very minor committee with the war over. He was personally pretty disappointed in this, but frankly, there were bigger issues at hand. Congress and the President, Andrew Johnson, were continuing to battle over their different views of Reconstruction. Congress, though, had the advantage. Veto-proof majorities in the House and the Senate. They would pass bills, Johnson would veto them, Congress would override the vetoes. Case in point, the Tenure of Office Act. Now, this law, which passed over Johnson's veto and then the override came in, required the advice and consent of the Senate for the removal of an officer who had been previously confirmed by the Senate. Well, Johnson basically said, this is unconstitutional. This is an attack on the presidency. I'm not going to stand for it. But they overrode his veto, and Johnson had some decisions to make because there was a member of his cabinet, Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, who was causing him all kinds of difficulties. He was much more aligned with the radicals in Congress than he was with the Johnson administration, and Johnson wanted him out. But now we had this law that was blocking him. So the law gave him permission to suspend Stanton while Congress was actually out of session. He did that. Congress came back. They put Stanton back in his job. And in February of 1868, Johnson had a decision to make. And he decided to basically violate federal law. He fired Edwin Stanton in direct conflict with the Tenure of Office Act. The radicals in Congress were thrilled. They had been searching for over a year for a reason to impeach Andrew Johnson, and now they had it, a direct violation of federal law, and James Garfield was perfectly aligned. He said the recklessness of Johnson left us no choice, and I hope we may now have done with him by putting him out of the way. Garfield did not vote for impeachment. Why? It happened so fast. It happened over a weekend, and he was away on other business, legal business, and he wasn't in D.C. at the time, and so he missed that vote. He certainly supported it and would have voted for it, came back and actually wanted to really enjoy watching this trial in the Senate, and he, like many, were disappointed. It was pretty boring, mostly filled with procedural motions and objections, and the case was clear. Johnson violated the Tenure of Office Act. Was that act constitutional? The senators had to kind of think through that, and would a supermajority, 2/3 vote to convict at this crime, violation of the Tenure of Office Act, to take Johnson out of office? Well, in the end, they would fail on that. As enough senators voted not guilty by a margin of 1, Andrew Johnson would finish his term. Now, there were only a few months left in the Johnson administration, and everyone was looking to the future. Who would be the standard bearer of the Republicans in 1868? Well, that was not much of a question. Commanding General Ulysses Grant was nominated immediately at the Republican convention. He would go up against Horatio Seymour, the Democrat, in the fall race, and Grant won the presidency easily in 1868. Now, James Garfield was really happy to have Andrew Johnson finally out of the White House, but he was not happy about Ulysses Grant. And this was personal. He was bitter toward Grant for a decision that Grant made during the Civil War, when Grant fired his boss and friend, Major General William Rosecrans, during the siege of Chattanooga. Garfield always thought that was unfair. It was a tarnish to Rosecrans's reputation. And he was bitter toward Grant, and that would continue during their tenure together in Washington, D.C. But Garfield didn't let that get in the way of areas that they were aligned. He was aligned with the fact that Jacob Cox from Ohio, a friend of his, was given a spot in the cabinet as the Secretary of Interior. That was a positive. They were also aligned on economics, on the currency. Garfield had long been on record, as had Grant, on supporting a specie-based economy backed in gold, trying to get off of the paper-based economy and the greenbacks that had been so prevalent during the war. They would be aligned on that topic. And they were also both aligned on black suffrage, the right to vote. The 15th Amendment was making its way through Congress. Garfield was a strong supporter, as was Grant, to make sure that there would be no discrimination against the right to vote based on race. They were aligned at least on a couple of these topics. Garfield very much also focused on his family during this tenure. He had already moved the family to D.C. They had been renting, and he decided, you know what, let's make it more permanent. I'm going to build my own home here in the nation's capital. Of course, he didn't have much money. He had never made much money, and certainly a congressional salary wasn't very much help. But he had some friends with money, including an Army buddy that, by the name of David Swaim, who loaned him half the money. In fact, Swaim was now working in D.C., helped oversee the construction of their new home. He needed a new home because his family was growing. Children number 4 was there, and number 5 was on the way. Plus, he needed space for his books, his hundreds and hundreds of books. James Garfield, a lifelong self-learner. He had books on almost every topic: history, literature, religion, economics, poetry, always reading and always imparting knowledge to his children. As he had become very much of a homebody, and dinner together with the family, he'd always be quizzing the kids to help expand their knowledge base, and also part of that ever-close bond that he was now finally having with his wife, Lucretia. He wrote to her that we no longer love because we ought to, but because we do. The tyranny of our love is sweet. We waited long for his coming, but he has come to stay. That statement was a long time in coming, and it was true. That bond, solid for the rest of their lives. Moving into Grant's second term, 1873. This was a tough year for the country and a tough year for James Garfield. The country had an economic panic, so this was difficult times. It was also, the second term was difficult for Ulysses Grant. His cabinet, one scandal after another. It seemed like everybody was on the take, and some of those scandals impacted people in Congress. One of them was around a company called Credit Mobilier, which was a front company for the Union Pacific Railroad. They basically used it to pass through costs and expenses and revenues to basically ensure that the stockholders in the railroad would always see a profit. And that railroad was in the process of building the Transcontinental Railroad. And for that, they were getting appropriations of support of money from Congress to help ensure that there were congressmen who were gifted stock at very low prices in Credit Mobilier. This seemed like bribery, at least to the New York Sun, who broke this open as a really big scandal. The House decided to investigate its own, and there were some big names involved. Former Speaker Schuyler Colfax, current Vice President Henry Wilson, and James Garfield were all accused one way or another of being involved in the Credit Mobilier scandal. Oaks Ames was the principal accuser against Garfield and had some paper trail about stock that had been offered to Garfield. It was unclear actually whether Garfield accepted the stock and the conditions. There was a question of whether this was a loan, was it a gift, was it a bribe? Fortunately for Garfield, this was all really confusing to the public. It was very nuanced, very technical kinds of discussions, and so it was sort of lost on the public other than sort of the big banner headlines. And Garfield, like most of his colleagues, eventually were cleared in the House. There was still that taint over whether or not he had been on the take during the scandal of Credit Mobilier. The next case involved the DeGolyer Paving Company, which had sought a contract with the D.C. Board of Public Works. And their attorney was Richard Parsons, who was a friend of James Garfield, both from Ohio. Well, Parsons was called back to Cleveland on some other business, and he asked Garfield to stand in for him on this topic. Garfield agreed, not that uncommon. A lot of congressmen who were lawyers would take cases during their congressional tenure, and Garfield waited for the session of Congress to end, and he took a couple of meetings with the D.C. Board of Public Works. And sure enough, DeGolyer got the contract that they were looking for. They paid Parsons $15,000, and Garfield got a third of that. And his political enemies cried foul. Two reasons. Number one, the size of the payment. Garfield's annual salary as a congressman was $5,000. He just got another $5,000 for taking a couple of meetings. In the political world, this seemed off. But also the fact that he was now the chair of the Appropriations Committee. And the Appropriations Committee in Congress had direct control of the budget of the city of Washington, D.C., including the Board of Public Works. And so there was this belief, although there's no hard evidence of malfeasance, nobody testified to this effect, and actually Garfield remained mute throughout this entire controversy. He never really talked about it or responded to the accusations, but the accusation was that he used his power and authority as the chair of the Appropriations Committee to sort of force this company into the Board of Works, rather, to give this company, his client, this contract. Eventually, again, it blew over. His political enemies would use it against him, but just another part of 1873 being a pretty tough year. And that continued with a passed piece of legislation. It was brought forward as an amendment to an appropriations bill by Benjamin Butler of Massachusetts. And it was an amendment to a bill to double the salary of the president, $25,000 to $50,000, and increase congressional salaries by 50%. $5,000 a year to $7,500 a year. And the thing that really got people upset about this was also the retroactive nature of the congressional increase back to the beginning of that Congress. So basically 2 years of supplemental pay for work that had already been accomplished. That would actually be unconstitutional now based on the 27th Amendment, but at that time it was a constitutional move. It was just very unpopular with the public, and actually was unpopular with James Garfield. As the chair of the committee, he fought this amendment in his committee. He fought the amendment when it came up in the conference committee with the Senate, but in the end, he didn't have the ability to stop it, and because it was part of a larger bill in the Appropriations Committee that he did support, he actually voted for it. Now, he said that after fighting it inch by inch as a captain would fight his ship in a naval battle, overpowered, boarded by those who took the other view, we were overborne until at last the nefarious measure was passed. Again, over his objection. Well, that objection was lost on a public that excoriated the people who put together what was called the salary grab bill. Just was odious in the minds of many people in the public, many people in Ohio, including Republicans who really lashed out at Garfield. In fact, some called for his resignation. Now, he was despondent over this, eventually got angry. He kind of pushed back on the pushback that he was getting, in part because he didn't accept that back pay. He actually returned that immediately to the Treasury once it was given to him. Very distasteful experience. Again, all part of this struggle of 1873, one task after another in the life of James Garfield. Of course, 1873, again, was a very difficult time for the country. The Panic of 1873, economically very difficult for many people across the country, and the move in Congress was to help them out by passing a bill for more greenbacks. It was called the inflation bill because greenbacks, paper money, were considered inflationary, which was helpful to borrowers. And the borrowers were many of the ones who were suffering, and they were all over the country. And they, of course, had powerful people in Congress who were supporting them, but not James Garfield. James Garfield was more than willing to accept some short-term pain to keep the country in a specie-based mindset, hard currency, to pay those debts in gold. And Ulysses Grant was aligned with Garfield on this. Ulysses Grant vetoed the inflation bill, and Garfield helped make sure that Congress would not override that veto. He also supported the president when he signed into law the Specie Resumption Act. And this actually made it even more formal. Now, it wasn't going to take effect until 1879, so a few years later. But at that point, it would be the policy of the federal government to redeem greenbacks in gold to, again, get the country back on that solid specie-based footing. Now, this was passed during a lame duck Congress in December of 1874. It was a lame duck as it was coming to an end, and it was going to be a very different Congress coming back. The new Congress, the Republicans, for the first time in years, would be in the minority because the troubles in the country, the scandals in the Grant administration, the Democrats did well at the polls and they were going to be in a majority when Congress came back. That was going to be a very different situation for James Garfield, who was now a veteran of Congress, ensconced in his world in Washington, D.C., but now he's going to be in the minority. We'll see what that's like in a future episode. That's James Garfield and Life in D.C. from the Life of James Garfield. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.